Hear the word of the Lord from Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 19. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld me from your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba. And Abraham stayed in Beersheba. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks, Micah. Well, good morning, church. Good morning. So good to be with you guys. I want to start off our time today just telling 3 stories as we get started. You know, in the 1800s, there was a Native American leader named Geronimo of the Apache tribe. And throughout his life, even from an early age, Geronimo was brutally forced to submit to authorities and enemies trying to take over his tribe's land. From witnessing the murders of his own family by non-native settlers to the U.S. government taking his tribe's land and moving them to another reservation, Geronimo and his people had had enough. So one day, Geronimo, along with 150 other of his tribe members, they escape and they go on the run for pretty much 2 decades. And eventually, the refugees of the Apache tribe became too exhausted and they were too outnumbered. Their days of eluding death and capture were finished, and they surrendered completely for the last time. In 1918, right at the end of the First World War, the Central Powers found themselves somewhat on the run as well. Between their loss of troops, territory, and artillery, they had come to terms with the inevitable surrender heading their way. This desperation resulted in German generals and politicians coming up with basically a Hail Mary to overtake the Allies on the Western Front. They devised a plan for a surprise attack to take place right before the battle would be halted by war officials. A last-minute grab for any power that would turn out to be unsuccessful, leading to their demise. Or how about in 2021, the Summer Olympics in Tokyo? After winning 4 gold medals and 1 bronze in 2016 and making history, Simone Biles' return to the Olympic stage in 21 was highly anticipated, and the social and public pressure that was on her was too much for her to handle. As the pressure begins to rise, affecting her preparation and performance leading up to the games, Simone said that she was actually feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders.
Due to a combination of mental health struggles, grief, and losing control over her own body during routines, Simone withdrew from the Olympic Games, resulting in an international controversy. And some ridiculed her for giving up, being selfish, and even some not honoring her country. Surrender didn't seem to be an option even for a famed Olympic athlete. What do these stories have in common? Because in a lot of ways, they are different. They're not exactly the same, and they surrender for different reasons. One, a Native American leader defending his land and his people. Another, a group of politicians clawing for any ounce of power they can obtain in the last minute. And then, a celebrity gymnast coming to terms and grips with her humanity, even when the world refused to. Despite their differences, I believe each story of surrender can come back to one thing, and that's control. It all comes back to control. Geronimo didn't surrender himself to the U.S. government one final time because he was lazy. He lost control of his energy and his capacity to stay on the run with his people. He lost control of the number of people that were out there searching for him. German officials lost control over their territories, and Simone Biles lost control over her own mindset and her own body due to the public and social pressure that she faced. But they didn't just give up blindly either. There were years of work, blood, sweat, and tears that they were pouring into each of their situations. Hard work. Years, if not decades, of that. 3 very different stories of running, strategizing, and working themselves to the bone. Can we relate in some way? Can you relate in some way? Because we're all grappling with a supposed loss, in the above examples, of forced surrender, of control. No matter if you are a type A perfectionist or the most go-with-the-flow free spirit, we all long to have control over almost everything in our lives. Whether or not we're after perfectly curated schedules, preferences, jobs, homes, relationships even. But the desire to control influences every single thing that we do. From the biggest questions of what do I want to do with my life? Where do I need to live? What kind of person do I need to marry? How will I raise my kids? And what do I truly need to be happy? To the smallest, and I would even say sometimes equally as dangerous, questions of how will I fill my free time? Should I go to that event or support group? Should I make time this weekend or this day to Sabbath and to rest and be with the Lord? And many, many more that we can name this morning. Now, don't get me wrong, church. These are great things that you have to be intentional with and you have to be prayerful about and submit to the Lord and have a say in at times as well. It's not just blind trust, once again, not just giving up. You should be intentional about how you fill your time and how you rest. You should be thinking about the kind of parent, spouse that you are or one day long to be. You should be overly intentional when thinking about what you want to do with your life, who you want to marry, or how you will serve your community and others around you. But friends, here is the good news that we will dive into more this morning, but I hope you're feeling comforted by. In the midst of all these overwhelming questions and realities of life, as followers and apprentices to Jesus, we are given the gift of freedom, surrendering ourselves to the one who is in control. The one who created us and holds the universe together in the palm of his hands. Unlike the stories told earlier, surrendering our control should not be based on exhaustion, insecurity, or even social pressure, but rather our active surrender to our Father should be the first step in the process of everything else to come. We aren't just giving up blindly. That's passivity. But church, we get to surrender, and that is a sacrifice. So today, it's our first gathering during the church calendar season of what's historically been known as Lent, and we're starting a teaching series entitled Surrender. As a quick aside, the church calendar, or it's more formally known the liturgical year, is a way to learn and live out the story of Jesus throughout the year. Instead of structuring our lives around the rhythms of our own responsibilities or the school calendar or even just the American annual calendar, whatever it looks like, we seek to be intentional and reorient our time around the story of the Messiah, Jesus. And what does this look like? The liturgical year is made up of 2 cycles of time. We have the cycle of light, focusing on the light of Christ breaking into the darkness, which is the seasons of Advent, Christmas, and Epiphany. And then we have the cycle of life, focusing on the death and resurrection of Jesus, bringing life into the world, which is the seasons of Lent, Easter, and Pentecost. We could also add a 3rd cycle alongside these 2, and that is the cycle of love, focusing on our spirit-empowered living out God's redeeming love of the world. Usually this cycle is what we call ordinary time. The cycles of light and life, though, are what we call extraordinary time. They help us live in the real world with our identities rooted in the story of Jesus. Each cycle walks us through the seasons of expectation, fulfillment, and proclamation of how we live. So there's the overview, and here we are today in the season of Lent. Lent invites us to an attitude of sober self-examination, to recognize our sin, but also a deeper relationship with Jesus as we walk with him towards his cross, anticipating his death and subsequent resurrection on Easter Sunday. It was such a beautiful time this past Wednesday with our brothers and sisters at Soma Midtown as we gathered to participate in Ash Wednesday with them. Beginning the season with an acknowledgement of our humanity, creating more space for the presence of God in our fasting. This will be a practice that we actually will be slowly introducing over the next few weeks at our communities called Sanctuary Circles, which we're super excited about. But this is simply just an invitation that we want you to consider. What is the Lord inviting you to surrender during this season of Lent? Maybe something physical, something emotional, something spiritual. What does that look like? And we'll go through and ponder that together in the weeks to come. We must surrender in order to create space for God in our lives. And the first installment of what we are surrendering, as we just referenced, is control. As we read earlier, our teaching text today comes from Genesis 22, and we're going to be specifically focusing on verses 1 through 19 as we read. For those who may be unfamiliar with the scriptures or you need a reminder, Abraham, or who was also known before this as Abram, he's our main guy for this passage today. Earlier in the book of Genesis, God established a covenant, or in other words, a promise between himself and Abraham, promising him land and many generations to come after him, and being a father to many nations. For instance, look at what God says to Abraham in Genesis 12. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. Sounds like a pretty sweet gig, right? Not only is Abraham being called by God and communicating directly with God, but he was also given the initial promise that God will bless him, protect him, and be faithful to him. And also that the restoration of the world comes through him and his family. So over the course of the next 10 chapters leading up to this morning's passage in chapter 22, Abraham continued to obey the Lord and walked according to his leading. However, Abraham's pattern of trust and obedience to the Lord came to an abrupt halt when God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac as an act of worship. Now, a few things here to note about Isaac. Between Abraham and his wife Sarah, Isaac is their only son. And not only is he their only son, but they waited around 25 years for their son to be born, from the time that God made the promise to the time that he was actually born. So Isaac was cherished and adored by his parents for so many reasons. He was the golden child in their eyes. Okay, so now that we've got some context for this family and the relationship between God and Abraham. Let's start at the beginning of the chapter in verse 1. It says, "Sometime later, God tested Abraham, and he said to him, 'Abraham, here I am,' he replied." As we build a foundation of surrender on God's word this morning, church, I don't want us to miss even just this small detail in how Abraham responds. Just so simple, yet so profound. "Here I am," he replied. What a posture of ready surrender. No questions asked, no bargaining, no asking if it can wait. "Hey, I'm busy. Not right now, God. What are you doing?" But he immediately responds, an active surrender. "Here I am. I'm reporting for duty, God. What do you need?" Posture of service and such a posture of ready surrender. And then in verse 2, God lays it all out for Abraham. "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac." Once again, Isaac, the cherished first child of the promise, the one who would supposedly bring to pass the vision of Abraham being the father of many nations. It all starts with this kid. "And go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain, and I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place that God had told him about. In modern-day Jerusalem, Mount Moriah is now the host to what is known as the Dome of the Rock, which is actually an Islamic shrine. But something to note here is that Mount Moriah sits relatively high above the city. So not only did God ask Abraham to sacrifice his son, but he ordered him to carry this out in a location that was visible and would make for a strenuous journey on him and his son and his servants. But do you notice how quickly things change from verse 2 to verse 3? I'm laughing because I just would not respond this way. God says, "Burn your son who you love so much," and it cuts scene to early the next morning. Abraham was getting to work. So if you still haven't gotten it, this is just crazy, even from the start. Abraham trusted the Lord so much that he literally left the next morning. He didn't put it off. He didn't ask for more time with his son or use stalling tactics. Homie wasn't getting the donkey ready at sunrise. Didn't even sleep in. None of us would be that way. Most of us can't even keep it together for 2 hours when we're going to have a confrontational conversation with a family member. But he knew that I am going to have to sacrifice my son, and yet I am ready. I'm here. Let's go. Here I am, Lord. So profound. Abraham was able to trust the Lord and lead his only son to a hilltop sacrifice for 3 whole days, because that's how long the journey took from where he was to Mount Moriah. This wasn't down the street. This wasn't just a half-day commute or walk. 3 days of traveling. He had to sit with that. But he was continually surrendering all of his control to God right from the start. We continue reading in verse 5. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." We will come back to you. Abraham knew what he was sent there to do. Wasn't anything in question. Why would he say that we, referring to him and Isaac, we will come back to you? Could it be because he was too ashamed and saddened by what was about to take place? Was it a nervous lie so that the servants wouldn't think of anything or interfere? He didn't have to give a reason. Was it all just wishful thinking at that point? Some biblical scholars do believe this was the case, but others suspect that Abraham said this to them confidently because he trusted in God's protection over his son that much. God had delivered Abraham from hardship and radical obedience before. So won't he do it again? Yes, maybe Abraham didn't know exactly how it would go down on Mount Moriah, but is there a possibility that he trusted God that much that he was willing to surrender? He proclaimed to his servants that they will see Isaac. come down that mountain. And another piece to note, even if it was out of a place of not wanting the guards to know what the Lord had commanded him to do, he still trusted the Lord that much that he wouldn't risk the servants even interfering with him obeying the Lord. He still assured them that everything was okay. Okay, let's keep moving on. And in my opinion, verse 7 starts one of the most heartbreaking and gut-wrenching parts of this story. As Isaac was carrying the materials up the hill, he began to notice. He knows what they're there for. He knows that they're there for a sacrifice, a burnt offering, an act of worship to the Lord. Look how Abraham responds to him in verse 8. God himself will provide the lamb for my burnt offering, my son. Not only had Abraham completely surrendered control to God, but it's important to know that he was still trusting the Lord at that point. He wasn't surrendering out of a place of guilt or even a quid pro quo blessing. He was truly surrendering his control because he trusted that God would provide. So much so that he was able to say these things like, "We will be back after we worship, and the Lord will supply." But just because Abraham trusted the Lord doesn't mean he backed out or treated this as a bluff to be called in some way. No, he actually continued to walk up the hill with Isaac to sacrifice him. Starting in verse 9, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on top of it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And then he reached out his hand, took the knife to slay his son. Once again, Abraham was still going through with it at this point. He didn't get to the top of the mountain and then immediately search for the lamb to be sacrificed. Well, the Lord told me it would be here. I felt him say that. I trusted him so much that I said that. So where is it? He didn't throw his hands up and say, "Okay, God, we're here. What do you want me to do now? Where's the lamb?" He didn't even tell Isaac what is actually going on or try to convince him to just trust his dad. "Son, everything will be okay. You'll figure it out later, but just trust me right now." Didn't even say anything about that. But he binds his son to the altar. Man, I'm not a father yet, but I can't imagine just the depth of emotions that Abraham is going through in this time. Once again, Isaac is the golden boy. He's the golden child, his only son that he waited 25 years for. And he was expected to put it aside, and he put aside his fierce love of a caring father, surrender control, and bind his son to the altar to be burned. After he did this, he then had his arms stretched out, knife in hand, ready to slay his son, only for an angel of the Lord to call out from heaven. And once again, do you see Abraham's response here? It's mirrored from verse 1. Once again, he is ready to surrender to the Lord. "Here I am." Anyone else would probably freak in this moment, right? Something like, "Oh, thank you, God, I did not want to have to do that." Or dropping the knife, getting up from the altar, and immediately going back on what the Lord had asked him to do. Abraham wasn't treating this call from the angel as a bailout of what he was asked to do. But with the same trust, obedience, and the same surrender of control, Abraham presents himself again to the will of the Lord. "Here I am." He didn't know what was next. But he said, "Lord, here I am." Verses 12 through 13. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. And it says in verse 14 that Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." He memorializes the remarkable way to which God fulfilled his expectation. So not only did Abraham demonstrate immense trust in the Lord, but he was demonstrating immense humility in this process as well. Here's how pastor and commentator David Guzik puts it. Abraham didn't name the place in reference to what he experienced. He didn't name it Mount Trial or Mount Agony or Mount Obedience. But instead, he named the hill in reference to what God did. He named it Mount Provision. He named it knowing God would provide the ultimate sacrifice for salvation on that hill someday. So we finish our teaching text today with these last several verses, 15 through 19, where God actually reconfirms his promise to Abraham in light of his faith. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this, have not withheld your son, your only son, I will bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." There's one thing that I primarily want us to notice from these 4 verses as it relates to our teaching today. This powerful section of verses does not consist of anything that Abraham has not heard already. If you look back on it and what we read from Genesis 12, none of this is new information to him. Remember God's words from that chapter. "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great. You will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on the earth will be blessed through you." Church, do you see it? Do you see what's going on? God reaffirms the promise of the blessing that seemed like it had been taken away from him. God recommits to work through Abraham because of his surrender. Abraham's surrender solidifies God's blessing. Abraham's surrender was the conduit for receiving the inheritance. Our surrender brings us back to God's longing to use us for the kingdom work ahead. Now, the Lord does refine us and renew us through our trials and suffering. That is good and holy, and there are beautiful blessings to be found on the other side of all those situations. But what if, during and on the other side of our surrender, of our control, our trials and our suffering, there isn't a pretty new, tangible gift for us on this earth, but rather, what if the gift is the reminder and the reconsecration of what the Lord has already been doing since the beginning of time and behind the scenes in each of our lives? The blessing and commissioning for each of us to go out and to serve his kingdom, to continue to make the Lord our strength, and to know that he is on the throne every step of the way. Now, I really hope and pray that none of us ever receive a command from the Lord to sacrifice our firstborn son. But we would be doing ourselves a disservice if we didn't take every single piece of the scripture to heart and see the invitation for personal application and how it relates to the control that we all so desperately long to have and are holding on to. So as we continue this morning, I just want to offer 3 insights for us as we begin Lent together to aid us in our practice of surrendering control. Remember, quitting is passivity, but true surrender, especially of the control in our lives, requires extreme sacrifice and a lot of intentionality. So number 1, surrendering control requires trust. Now, please hear me. Trusting in the Lord does not equal blind allegiance or blind trust. It's actually an active invitation that is extended to you and I for a life that is more abundant and more fruitful and more joyful than we ever could imagine. Yes, Abraham went up the mountain with no questions asked, but it was because he had seen the glory and the work of the Lord in his life so evidently leading up to that moment. Not only through an initial promise from God earlier, like we read, but through many experiences in his life and God's evident faithfulness in his life. He was given every reason to trust God with his entire life. He's given every reason to trust God with his firstborn son. If you're a follower of Jesus, think of the ways that God has been faithful to you over the course of your life. In what ways has he shown up? And in what ways have you seen the provision and faithfulness of the Lord on display? Now, could the same God who's seen you through to this point, that is the reason you are here right now, be extending that invitation to you for deeper trust in every single thing to come? No matter where you're at in your faith, no matter if you even believe, that is something we all need to consider. None of us are exempt from that. Number 2, surrendering control requires humility. It's one thing to trust the Lord in our surrendering of control, but we need to realize how little power we actually possess in the process, if any at all. We must surrender our preconceived notions that if we just trust enough, then we can get some control over our lives and really just check the box that we trust God. We must remember that He is God and we are not. That requires humility. Abraham humbled himself enough to know that he wasn't the one in control. No level of status, bargaining, or power could enable him to hide from what the Lord was commanding of him. But instead, he got up the next morning and he embarked on a 3-day journey, walked himself up the mountain, and trusted the Lord with humility. Here's how Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann summarizes this as we embark on the journey through Lent. I imagine Lent for you and for me as a great departure from the greedy, anxious, anti-neighborlessness of our economy, a great departure from our exclusionary politics that fears the other, a great departure from self-indulgent consumerism that devours creation, and then an arrival in a new neighborhood, because it is a gift to be simple, it is a gift to be free, and it is a gift to come down right where we ought to be. Right where we ought to be. A great departure, but no, rather a great surrender. A surrender into humility. So simple yet so profound. Finding humility in our surrender doesn't look like what the world is doing. It doesn't look like elevating ourselves any higher than before. We don't get lifted up on a high pedestal above humanity or even other Christians because we trust God more or we have surrendered more. But church, it all relates back to this simple delight, the simple delight that is found in the gift of trusting God and lowering ourselves where we ought to be. Sinful humans who are actually in need of the one who is in control. Some of you may be familiar with the story of how the sanctuary came to be. And for us, for me, I should say personally, it starts when my wife Katie and I, we started to just discern and sense from the Lord that a change was coming. And we didn't really have any specific pictures or words or visions or anything clear, really. But all we knew at the beginning of 2022, that the Lord was going to make a big change sometime soon. And we had no clue what that was going to look like. We were waiting with open ears and eyes for what the Lord may be wanting to reveal to us. So what started as curious optimism quickly turned to hardship as the Lord was making it evident that He was calling us out of our current ministry assignment. Something that came with so many questions, arguing with God and even one another, and ultimately feeling like we had lost control of what we thought and dreamed that our mid-20s would be like. We found ourselves in what would be several months of praying daily and seeking what was next from God. Now, don't be fooled, everyone. This is not a story of I trusted the Lord so much, I was so humble that I left the ministry I was a part of, and it was all smooth from there, and the Lord made a path. He made a path all right, but it wasn't the one that I was walking down at that time. So don't be fooled, not so fast. As we entered that summer that year, I started to spiral emotionally, and I tried to take everything into my own control. By this point, I had an end date at my previous ministry role, and it was time for me to cook up what I thought the Lord was leading us towards. I wouldn't say that I was bitter towards God, but I definitely thought deep down that my plan and my thoughts, hopes, and dreams were better than his. I wouldn't say that I was opposed to going back into full-time ministry, but anytime a position or a role was thrown my way from some friends or other churches, I just had this pit in my stomach. Like, man, I don't know. Maybe the Lord's not doing that. I don't know. I was a little standoffish to it, honestly. I wouldn't say that I wasn't trusting God, but I definitely had my hands clenched a little too tight in terms of, once again, what I wanted. Katie and I would sit at the dinner table a lot of nights and process and dream about what the Lord was doing in our lives. We hoped whatever was next would allow us to dive deeper into our immediate community here in Broad Ripple and would enable us to focus on ministering to our neighborhood. It was incredibly exciting, but we also had the thought in our back, I had the thought, I should say, in the back of my head, well, how the heck is that going to happen? I don't think it's going to happen right now. Maybe that's a 5, 10, 20-year goal. We'll see what the Lord does. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. So in the midst of trying to control everything that I thought I could, having a running list on my phone of jobs that were outside of vocational ministry, my good friend and ministry co-laborer at the time as well, Micah, he pulls me aside one day and he says, hey, remember a year ago when we sat around and dreamed of planning a church together? Well, there is a network of people that want to talk about what that could look like with us. I go, huh. Some of you may be chuckling to yourself right now because the desire to take a break from vocational ministry and planting a church, they couldn't be more opposite from one another, which is a good thing. I needed that. They don't easily walk hand in hand, and I definitely didn't demonstrate radical trust and humility like Abraham did in this passage. When Micah said that, I didn't think, here I am, Lord, reporting for duty. What are you doing? What do you need? I'm here. No, absolutely not. That was not my response. But as Micah and I, alongside our wives, started to engage in conversations and coaching about what this could look like, and we began to dream, it was incredibly exciting, but it was equally as terrifying, all at the same time. I felt the Lord continually saying to me in my times of prayer and wrestling, do you really trust me? Have you surrendered your plans for the abundant life that you're seeking, or have you surrendered your plans to my abundant life that I have for you? It was time for me to surrender my control. It was time for me to truly trust, and it was time for me to truly get on my face and be humble before the Lord and submit to Him. As we talked about earlier, this wasn't quitting. This wasn't just blind allegiance. This wasn't waiting for God to bail me out of a hard situation of leaving a previous ministry. This had to be a true surrender for us if it was going to happen. Katie and I would always say to each other during this time, and still do in a lot of situations, if God keeps opening up the doors, we will keep walking right through them, saying, Lord, it's all yours. And if this is what you desire for our lives and our neighborhood, it is all yours. We give it all to you. And friends, I tried it. I tried to take it all into my own control, under the facade of I'm following the Lord's leading even. And that is true and that is good, and that happens. But if it's not done with true trust and true humility, we're not on the right path. We are not truly surrendering our control to the Lord. And it doesn't end there either. To be honest, it's something that we are still walking through. Just like Abraham had to continually surrender control in the days, months, and years to come. Surrendering control didn't get easier because now we had a church name, a mission, a vision, some of our best friends to co-plant and pastor alongside. Surrendering control didn't get easier when we had a launch team, a huge amount of generosity, a building to gather in, equipment, and now a beautiful and thriving congregation to which we are so grateful for. Praise the Lord. All of these magnificent blessings from the Lord and testaments to His faithfulness and provision. They're from Him. But none of them give us any reason to stop surrendering our humility and our trust to try to gain control back. Just because now we're on the other side, quote unquote, of that situation. Now I don't get to gain the control back. I don't say, okay, God, you brought me here. That sounds great. Now we're going to do what we want to do. No, it's a continual process. And I pray that the sanctuary continues to be a place that holds every single person, decision, and challenge with open hands. Because the Lord is the only reason we are here today with these particular people in this particular place in this particular moment. Finally, surrendering control requires repetition. Here's Jesus in Luke 9. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit their very self? Being a disciple and following Jesus takes trust. Taking up a cross and following Jesus daily takes humility, but actually doing that daily requires repetition. Having a here I am response to the Lord requires trust. Being willing to take your son to the top of a mountain and sacrifice him requires humility. And saying yes over and over again to those commands and even slow, unhurried invitations, that takes repetition. This wasn't the first time Abraham had to trust in the Lord. Genesis chapters 12 through 21, all the way up until our text today in chapter 22, are filled with many instances, battles, and struggles where Abraham really had to trust the Lord. It required repetition for him to get that place of full trust and full humility. It didn't just come right away in Genesis 22, but there are years and decades before of putting that into practice. Friends, what if we were able to live and demonstrate a faith more like Abraham? And even more, what if we were able to surrender our control like Abraham did? Once again, from the biggest questions of what do I want to do with my life? Where do I need to live? What kind of person do I need to marry? How will I raise my kids? And what do I need to be truly happy? To the smallest and equally as dangerous questions. How will I fill my free time? Will I go to that support group or that event? Or will I make time to dwell in the presence of the Lord and to invite him into every situation, to Sabbath with him, to practice the way of Jesus? From life's biggest worries to smallest insecurities, surrendering control is required of all of us. No matter if you pride yourself on being very organized or you would tell people, I go with the flow, I love change, it's all okay. Like, I don't need to surrender much control. I don't really have a lot of control. Let the Lord search the depths of your heart and you will be ashamed of what he finds and what you find. But not out of a place of staying in that shame, but a place of being redeemed from that longing to control, of being redeemed from the longing that we all have to have everything in the palm of our hands, but not being willing to open our hands and the reminder that the Lord has everything in his hands. Could God be extending the invitation to surrender control over your finances or something material? Maybe there's a certain goal or luxury that you've always longed for and wanted, and it's actually caused you to run dry or become overly protective of what God has already blessed you with. For the parents in the room, could God be inviting you to surrender control over your children? He has equipped and called you to be an amazing parent and to love your kids so well and fiercely. But is there something that you're holding on to too tightly? What would it look like to humbly trust the Lord with your kids? Or maybe could God be inviting you to surrender control over a certain relationship in your life? Whether that be with a family member, a significant other, or a friend. You've tried to do everything yourself. You've tried every self-help step to repair what's been broken, but you keep coming up short. I just feel led right now to acknowledge also the people who are trying to control everything in their efforts of family planning. That you've done everything, You've gone to specialists, you've gone to doctors, and you're just looking for hope. You're looking for control. But maybe, just maybe, you just haven't fully surrendered the control over to God and His timing, His will, and what He longs to do in your life. So much easier said than done. So much easier said than done. Not said lightly in any way. But we're invited to do that in every aspect of our life. Even when others may tell us that they have the answers, or if you just do this, it's going to work. It goes for anything in life. But if you truly haven't surrendered the control and laid it at the feet of Jesus, maybe that's the invitation being extended to you. And church, I just want to remind you again, like we talked about in the 3 stories at the beginning and even in the scripture, we don't surrender to an enemy. We don't surrender to social pressure, peer pressure. We don't surrender to the devil. We don't surrender anything except when we are surrendering it to the Lord. As followers of Jesus, we get the great joy of surrendering our trust and being humble before the Lord. The Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. The one who is on the throne, who gave His only Son so that we may dwell in the house of the Lord with Him forever and ever. Truly, what do we as humans have to fear if that's the gift we are given? To surrender humbly our control and our trust to the Lord. But what did a father have to fear? Offering his son as a sacrifice, going through a 3-day period of waiting, a 3-day journey that was grueling and hard, in order to receive the full embodiment of God's promise and blessing on the other side. What did a father have to fear? Sending his son to earth as a sacrifice to be sentenced to death, to be ridiculed and abused. A 3-day period of waiting after a brutal crucifixion on the cross. But in order to receive the full embodiment of God's promise, in order to receive salvation, to receive hope restored to the world, and abundant grace for you and for me. Do you see it, church? Not only a reality from our text today in Genesis 22, but a reality that altered history of the world and history of mankind. Not a ram stuck nearby, but a Messiah, the Lamb of God, lowering himself in trust and humility and surrendering control every step of the way. Day after day, practicing the way of Jesus. And church, may we go and do the same. Amen.